The summer of 1943 on the Eastern Front was a season of tense, unnatural quiet. For months following the catastrophic German surrender at Stalingrad, a fragile stalemate had settled over the vast Ukrainian steppe. But this was not a peace. It was the lull before the storm. Both sides knew that the German war machine, humiliated and bloodied, was incapable of accepting this new status quo. It needed to strike back, to prove that the blitzkrieg still had teeth, and to sever the Red Army's growing confidence at its root. And so, they chose their target, a massive 150-mile-wide bulge in the front lines around the city of Kursk, a salient that seemed to beg for a classic pincer-moving encirclement. In the German High Command, this plan, code-named Operation Citadel, became an article of faith. It was to be the definitive battle of attrition, the Vernich-Tungschlacht that would bleed the Soviets white and reclaim the strategic initiative for the Reich. To ensure this victory, they delayed the offensive for months, not out of hesitation, but to amass a force of unprecedented power. They funneled their finest divisions and their most advanced weapons to the front. The formidable Tiger I tanks, the new Panther, and the massive Ferdinand tank destroyers. This was to be the armored fist of the Wehrmacht, the most powerful concentration of German military might ever assembled for a single operation. The air crackled with a nervous anticipation, the grim resolve of a gambler preparing to stake everything on one final, decisive roll of the dice. Yet, across the quiet fields and rolling hills of the Kursk salient, a very different kind of preparation was taking place. The Soviets, tipped off by intelligence from their own spies and allied codebreakers, were not sitting idle. They knew the German plan in intimate detail. Instead of preparing an offensive of their own, they turned the entire salient into a colossal, layered killing zone. Under the command of brilliant strategists like Georgy Zhukov, they constructed vast, intricate networks of trenches, millions of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, and thousands of artillery pieces pre-sighted on every likely approach. The Red Army was no longer the disorganized force of 1941. It had learned, it had adapted, and it was waiting. The stage was not set for a dramatic German victory, but for a brutal, grinding battle of annihilation where the hunter was about to become the prey. The stakes could not have been higher. This was not merely a fight for a single city, but for the future of the entire Eastern Front. The failure of Citadel would mean that Germany's last great offensive power was spent, and the initiative would be lost to the Soviet Union forever. The Kursk salient was a cartographer's dream and a general's nightmare. Jutting over 150 miles westward into the German front line, this massive bulge, which encompassed the city of Kursk and a vast area of surrounding farmland and steppe, represented a glaring strategic vulnerability. On a map, its contours presented an almost irresistible target. For the German High Command, schooled in the doctrines of mobility and encirclement that had brought them such stunning successes earlier in the war, the salient was a perfect setup for a classic pincer movement. The plan, designated Operation Citadel, was deceptively simple in conception. One powerful German army group, Model's Ninth Army, would strike southward from the Oral salient in the north. Simultaneously, an even more potent force, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf, would drive northward from the Belgorod area in the south. The objective was for these two steel jaws to meet east of Kursk, neatly severing the neck of the salient and trapping the entire Soviet Central and Voronezh fronts within a massive pocket. The destruction of these forces would not only shorten the German line and free up reserves, but, they hoped, deliver a psychological blow from which the Red Army could not recover, reversing the disastrous momentum that had begun at Stalingrad. This strategic logic, however, came with a catch: timing and technology. In the initial heady days of planning in early 1943, the operation was predicated on speed, aiming for a strike in late April or early May before the Soviets could recover from the winter campaigns. But as the plan evolved, it became intertwined with the promise of new war-winning technology. The German High Command, and Hitler in particular, became convinced that the sheer qualitative superiority of their new armored vehicles could overwhelm any quantitative Soviet advantage. The delay for these weapons became the central, and ultimately fatal, point of contention. The cornerstone of this technological gamble was the medium Panther tank. Designed specifically in response to the Soviet T-34, The Panther boasted sloped armor, a high-velocity 75 mm gun that could punch through any Soviet armor at long range, and good mobility. It was intended to be the backbone of the assault. Alongside it was the heavier Tiger I, already feared for its devastating 88 mm gun and thick armor, and the more unconventional Ferdinand tank destroyer. A product of the failed Porsche Tiger design, the Ferdinand was a behemoth, a turretless chassis mounting the same 88 mm gun in a fixed casemate, protected by massive, slab-sided armor that was virtually impervious to frontal fire from standard Soviet anti-tank guns. The German leadership believed that by waiting to field these machines in significant numbers, ultimately deploying over 200 Ferdinands and 300 Panthers at Kursk, they could deliver a technological knockout blow that would shatter Soviet defenses. This decision to delay the offensive from May to early July, however, gifted the Soviets the two most precious commodities on the battlefield: time and information. That information was the key to the entire Soviet strategy, which was a masterpiece of defensive planning and intelligence work. Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, and its spy networks, most notably the Lucy Ring in Switzerland, provided a stunningly accurate picture of German intentions. They knew not only the broad outlines of Citadel but often the specific units involved, their strengths, and even the planned start date. This allowed the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, to make a crucial and deliberate decision. They would not launch a preemptive offensive. Instead, they would let the Germans attack into a prepared fortress, absorbing their blow and grinding down their elite panzer divisions in a battle of attrition, a form of warfare for which the Soviets, with their vast resources and deeper reserves, were far better suited. Under the supervision of generals like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, the Soviets undertook the most ambitious defensive works in military history. They transformed the Kursk salient into a layered, interlocking death trap of unprecedented depth and complexity. The defenses stretched back over 180 miles, consisting of not one or two, but 8 consecutive defensive belts, with the densest concentrations in the north and south where the main attacks were expected. Each belt was a labyrinth of trenches, anti-tank strongpoints, and machine gun nests. But the true genius lay in the integration of obstacles and firepower. The forward slopes were sown with millions of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, creating dense minefields with densities of over 2,000 mines per kilometer in some sectors. These were not random scatterings. They were carefully planned killing zones, channeling attacking armor into fire sacks, covered by pre-registered artillery and anti-tank guns. The Soviets deployed a staggering number of anti-tank rifles, 45 mm, 57 mm, and 76 mm guns, and crucially, massed artillery, including entire regiments of the fearsome Katyusha rocket launchers. The defensive doctrine was one of mutual support and depth. No strongpoint was expected to hold out alone. If one fell, the attackers would immediately come under fire from supporting positions on the flanks and from subsequent lines. Behind the main lines, large mobile reserves, including the powerful 5th Guards Tank Army, were held back, ready to counterattack any breakthrough. The entire system was designed with one single brutal purpose: to slow, disorganize, and bleed the German panzer divisions white. The Soviets understood that the German strength was their tactical initiative and coordination, the Schwerpunkt, or point of main effort. By forcing them to batter themselves against these deep, elastic defenses, the Soviets aimed to break up that coordination, isolate the spearheads, and turn the Germans' greatest strength, their armored fist, into a liability. By the time the first German tanks began to roll forward on the morning of July 5th, they were not launching a surprise attack against an unprepared enemy. They were charging headlong into the most sophisticated and lethal defensive network ever devised, meticulously prepared by an enemy that knew they were coming. The thunder of the preparatory barrage in the northern sector, launched by General Walter Model's 9th Army a few hours before dawn on July 5th, was meant to be the prelude to a swift and violent rupture of the Soviet line. Yet, from the outset, the German assault met a resistance that was both resilient and deeply layered. Model, a pragmatic and defensive expert, was himself skeptical of Citadel's chances and chose a cautious infantry-heavy approach, aiming to clear the way for his panzers. But this methodical advance played directly into the hands of the Soviet Central Front, commanded by Konstantin Rokossovsky. The Germans immediately found themselves entangled in the nightmarish web of the first Soviet defensive belts. Vast minefields, some containing over 2,500 mines per square kilometer, halted armored columns in their tracks, making them sitting ducks for pre-sighted artillery and anti-tank guns. The Ferdinand tank destroyers, for all their imposing frontal armor and powerful guns, proved to be a flawed asset in this environment. While they could destroy Soviet tanks at long range with impunity, they were mechanically unreliable, incredibly slow, and critically lacked machine guns for close-range defense. Soviet infantry, displaying breathtaking bravery, would often let them pass before swarming them with Molotov cocktails, explosive charges, or by simply climbing onto the vehicle and disabling it through its vision slits. The fighting was a brutal yard-by-yard slog through a continuous series of fortified villages, trench lines, and anti-tank strongpoints. Key positions like the village of Panai, which changed hands multiple times in a maelstrom of close-quarters combat, earned the grim nickname the Stalingrad of the Kursk salient. After a week of the most ferocious fighting, Model's Ninth Army had advanced barely 6 miles into the Soviet defenses at a catastrophic cost. Its offensive power was spent, ground down against the anvil of Rokossovsky's unyielding defenses. The northern pincer of Operation Citadel had been decisively blunted and broken. In the south, however, the story was different in its execution, but would ultimately prove just as fatal in its conclusion. Here, Field Marshal Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf wielded a far more powerful and concentrated armored fist, including the elite 2 SS Panzer Corps. Hoth favored a bold armor-centric thrust, using his tanks as the spearhead to punch through the Soviet lines. This led to some of the most intense and costly armored engagements of the entire war. The Soviet Voronezh front under Nikolai Vatutin was subjected to immense pressure. German formations, employing their classic combined arms tactics, made painful but perceptible gains, fighting their way through the 1st and 2nd defensive belts. The new Panther tanks, however, suffered from severe teething problems. Many broke down with mechanical failures before even reaching the battlefield, and their side armor was vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank rifles and guns. Yet, the sheer weight of German armor, particularly the Tigers and the veteran Panzer Grenadiers of the SS divisions Leibstandard, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, pushed relentlessly forward. Battles at points like the strategic hill 252.2 near the village of Pokrovka were scenes of carnage, with entire companies of tanks destroyed in a single day. The Germans were paying a staggering price for every mile, but by July 12, after a week of brutal combat, Hoth's forces had carved a deep, narrow corridor into the Soviet defenses. Their immediate objective was to break out into the open operational rear, and the last major obstacle standing in their path was the small railway town of Prokhorovka. It was here that the climax of the Battle of Kursk, and one of the most iconic tank battles in history, was about to unfold. The Battle of Prokhorovka, fought on July 12, has been immortalized in legend as the largest tank battle in history, a claim modern historians have refined but which does little to diminish its sheer, apocalyptic ferocity. The Soviet High Command, recognizing the critical threat of Hoth's southern thrust, committed its premier strategic reserve, General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army. The stage was set for a colossal counterstroke designed to meet and destroy the German spearhead head-on. As dawn broke over the rolling fields west of Prokhorovka, the 2 SS Panzer Corps was preparing to resume its own attack. What happened next was not a single choreographed clash, but a series of violent, chaotic engagements across a constrained battlefield, with the most famous occurring in a shallow valley near the Oktyabrski State Farm. As the Soviet T-34s, many fitted with extra fuel drums that made them vulnerable fire traps, crested the ridges, they charged directly into the advancing German formations. The Soviets, recognizing the superior range and armor of the German Tigers and Panthers, executed a desperate and brutal doctrine: close the distance at maximum speed. By eliminating the range advantage, they turned the battle into a point-blank melee where the T-34's maneuverability and faster turret traverse could theoretically balance the scales. The result was a scene of unparalleled chaos and destruction. Hundreds of tanks became entangled in a swirling, choking cloud of dust, smoke, and fire. Visibility dropped to near zero, and command control disintegrated into a series of isolated, savage duels. Tanks fired at silhouettes that emerged suddenly from the gloom, often at ranges of less than 100 meters. The air grew thick with the smell of diesel, cordite, and burning flesh. It was in this inferno that accounts, some perhaps apocryphal but emblematic of the battle's spirit, tell of T-34 crews, their guns ineffective against a Tiger's frontal plate, resorting to ramming the heavier German tanks, shearing off their tracks and wheels in a suicidal effort to immobilize them. Crews of disabled tanks fought on with machine guns and sidearms, while others, their vehicles brewing up, scrambled from burning hatches only to be cut down in the open. The sky was blackened by smoke from hundreds of burning wrecks, which littered the landscape like smoldering graves. While later analysis suggests the forces engaged at the key point of contact were smaller than once believed, perhaps 300 to 400 Soviet tanks against 200 to 300 German, and that German losses, particularly in Tigers, were not as one-sided as Soviet reports claimed, the fundamental truth remains. Prokhorovka was a brutal battle of attrition of a scale and intensity that defies comprehension. When the fighting subsided, the field was a charnel house of twisted metal. The 5th Guards Tank Army had lost over half its tanks, but it had achieved its strategic objective. The 2 SS Panzer Corps was halted, its offensive power crippled. The German drive toward Prokhorovka, and with it the southern pincer of Operation Citadel, was stopped dead. The Wehrmacht's last great offensive in the east had reached its high-water mark, and on the scorched fields around Prokhorovka, it began its irreversible ebb. The true masterstroke of the Soviet strategy at Kursk lay not merely in their formidable defense, but in what they had prepared to unleash the moment the German offensive lost its momentum. Even as the titanic armored clashes at Prokhorovka and the grinding attrition in the north were reaching their crescendo, the Soviet high command was already shifting gears. They had never intended for the battle to be a purely defensive affair. The defense of the salient was simply the first, brutal phase of a much larger operational design. The German panzer divisions, the Wehrmacht's irreplaceable spearhead, were now precisely where the Soviets wanted them. Exhausted, depleted, and locked in a bloody stalemate in the Kursk sector. This was the moment to initiate the war's second phase, the great counteroffensives, codenamed Operations Kutuzov and Rumiantsev. These were not localized counterattacks, but massive strategic-level operations involving multiple fronts, designed to collapse the entire German line. Operation Kutuzov struck first on July 12th, the very same day as the Battle of Prokhorovka. Launched by the Western and Bryansk fronts to the north of the Kursk salient, its target was the German 2nd Panzer Army holding the Oral salient, which itself formed the northern shoulder of the Kursk bulge. This was a masterful strategic move. The German 9th Army, which had been attacking the northern face of Kursk, now found itself threatened with encirclement from the rear. The Soviets, employing immense concentrations of artillery and fresh infantry and tank armies, smashed into German forces that had been stripped of reserves to feed the Citadel offensive. The fighting around Oral was fierce, but the Soviets possessed an overwhelming advantage in men and material. They advanced methodically, forcing the Germans into a costly and disorganized retreat. The success of Kutuzov created an impossible strategic dilemma for Hitler. His forces in the south were still technically advancing, albeit at a snail's pace and at horrific cost, but now his entire position in the north was unraveling. This dilemma was compounded just weeks later, on August 3rd, when the Soviets launched Operation Rumiantsev. This offensive was directed by the Voronezh and Steppe fronts against the weakened German forces in the Belgorod-Kharkov sector, the very base from which Hoth's southern pincer had launched its attack. The German divisions here, particularly the elite SS Panzer units, were shadows of their former selves, their tank strength decimated, their infantry exhausted, and their supplies low. After a devastating artillery barrage that dwarfed the initial German bombardment at the start of Citadel, the Soviet steamroller advanced. The Red Army had learned its lessons well. This was no reckless charge, but a powerful, coordinated, deep battle operation, breaching German defensive lines with shocking speed. Key cities like Belgorod and Kharkov, which the Germans had fought so desperately to capture and hold, were liberated in quick succession. The Soviet advance now gained an operational momentum that would become characteristic of the remainder of the war on the Eastern Front. Faced with this twin collapse, Adolf Hitler was forced to confront reality. On July 13th, even as the dust was settling at Prokhorovka, he summoned his commanders to his headquarters in East Prussia and announced the termination of Operation Citadel. The strategic reserve divisions he had been hoarding for the exploitation phase of the offensive were now desperately needed to plug the gaps torn open by Operations Kutuzov and Rumiantsev. The call to withdraw was a moment of profound symbolic and military significance. For the first time in the war, a major German summer offensive had been halted not by weather or logistics, but by the sheer defensive and counteroffensive power of the Red Army. The initiative on the Eastern Front, seized by the Germans in June 1941, had now irrevocably passed to the Soviet Union. From this point onward, the Wehrmacht was condemned to a permanent defensive posture, reacting to Soviet blows and fighting a long, bloody retreat back toward the borders of the Reich. There would be no more grand offensives, no more miracles. The German army was now in a battle of attrition it was mathematically destined to lose. The losses suffered during the Battle of Kursk and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensives cemented this fate. The numbers, though debated, are staggering in their scale and, for Germany, in their finality. In the roughly 6 weeks of fighting encompassing Citadel, Kutuzov, and Rumiantsev, the Germans lost an estimated 200,000 to 250,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. But it was the material losses, particularly in armor, that were truly catastrophic. Germany lost over 1,500 tanks and assault guns destroyed or damaged beyond repair. This included a significant proportion of its new, technologically superior Panther and Tiger tanks, as well as the formidable Ferdinand tank destroyers. These were not just numbers on a ledger. They represented the core of the German army's offensive striking power. The industrial and logistical capacity of the Third Reich, already straining under Allied bombing campaigns, could simply not replace these losses at the speed or scale required. The Soviet Union, by contrast, despite suffering even higher absolute losses, perhaps as many as 800,000 casualties and 6,000 tanks, possessed a deep well of manpower and an industrial base that was now vastly outproducing Germany. For every T-34 destroyed, another could be rolled out from a factory in the Urals. For every German tank crew lost, they were replaced by a less experienced soldier. The equation was simple and brutal. The Battle of Kursk broke the spine of the German panzer forces. It had been a colossal wager, and Hitler had lost. The strategic reserve of the Wehrmacht was gone, consumed in the fire and steel of the Kursk salient, and the road to Berlin was now open.